Samuel Morse is an enigma. For the first 3 decades of his life, Morse showed little sign that he would invent a world-changing technology. He was born and raised in Massachusetts in the early days of the country, soon after the Constitution took effect. Morse graduated from Yale in 1810 at the ripe old age of 19. While at that fine institution, he studied religion, mathematics, and equestrian science. Though he did not study electricity, he did attend lectures by the famous scientists Benjamin Philemon and Jeremiah Day on electricity as it was understood in those early years. Now, what he really did was he painted. In fact, he supported himself through college working as a portrait painter. This was before the day of the camera. You couldn't just take a photograph of something. If you wanted an image of something, a human had to draw it or paint it. So there was a huge demand for good painters. And this was a good profession where educated, skilled people could earn quite a good living. Young Samuel showed great promise as a painter. In fact, just out of college in 1811, his work caught the eye of Washington Allston, who was perhaps the most famous artist in the country at the time. Allston persuaded Morse and Morse's father to go along with the idea of taking Morse with him to study in Europe. Under his careful tutelage, Morse's technique improved, and he soon joined the Royal Academy in England. Now, he arrived in England just before the War of 1812 started. So he found himself isolated from the United States until the war was over. He returned to the U.S. in 1815, where he quickly became a successful and very much in-demand portrait painter. He married and lived in New Haven with his father and his young bride. But tragedy finally struck in 1825. Morse had traveled from his home in New Haven to Washington, D.C. to paint a commissioned portrait of Lafayette. One day he received a letter from his father indicating that his wife was convalescent, or recovering from a serious illness. This was the first Samuel had heard of her being sick. The next day he received a second missive from his father informing Samuel of his wife's death and her subsequent burial. This, of course, left Morse heartbroken. And he was very frustrated at the slow communications of the day, which had not given him the opportunity to return to his dying bride's side in time. Now, this is before there were railroads or other high-speed forms of travel. So it would have taken him several days to get back from to New Haven from Washington, D.C. Starting in 1830, Morse decided to return to Europe for 2 years to learn new painting techniques and to visit Italy, France, and Switzerland. This was not uncommon as a way to break out of his previous techniques and to improve his understanding of the technologies of painting as they were evolving in that era. On the return voyage, however, his life took a dramatic turn. And here is where the great inventor comes out. Another passenger on the ship, a polymath named Charles Jackson, showed Morse how an electromagnet operated. He apparently had some equipment with him, and on the long, slow ship voyage, they played with his electromagnetic equipment. Morse quickly realized that a simple key switch could energize an electromagnet at a distance, such that an observer could know whether the key switch was opened or closed. Now, this is not a surprise. Most of the demonstrations of electromagnets involved a battery and a switch and an electromagnet, which is essentially what he was describing here. But Morse added to that. He invented a way for the receiver to record the signal by making an indentation in a paper tape that was driven by a clockwork mechanism. The tape could then be run through the system again, and the indents could then be used to control the key and to retransmit the same message. Now, of course, the sound the receiver made was the familiar clicking and clacking noise that we associate with classic telegraphs. But Morse took the one step farther. He realized it was possible to transmit information through this simple on-off process. He soon developed a code based upon short and long signals, known as dots and dashes. One feature of the Morse code was that the most common symbols are the shortest, with the letter E being the most popular, is a single dot, while the much less common letter P required 5 dots. A combination of simple keying system and a way to encode information was all that was required for the telegraph. There were other inventors pursuing similar ideas, but most were either complex, some of them using 1 wire per letter, or suffered from other limitations. As we will discuss in the talk about Tesla, direct current signals such as Morse's telegraph lose strength over long distances. There's a limit to how far transmitters and receivers can be separated. In that day, the limit was about 2 miles. But the fact that the receiver could automatically record the incoming message and that the same recording could then be replayed down the line made it possible to send a message by stages over long distances. In fact, in principle, over very long distances. Morse also recognized that it was unnecessary to record and then replay the message, with the ensuing cost and delay associated with such recording. Instead, he used Henry's relay, that he called a repeater, to regenerate the signal. Suddenly, the signal could be sent long distances in essentially real time. These 2 ways to forward the message, along with the fact that the system required only a single wire, made it ideally suited for cheap deployment around the world. In 1851, Morse's system was adopted throughout Europe, everywhere but Britain. In Britain, they were still committed to native development by Cook and Whetstone. In 1856, the first transatlantic cable was laid. Now, Morse, though he was a well-educated man, was not a master of the final details of electricity, even as they were known in his time. Morse was dependent upon others for their technical expertise and assistance. In some cases, Morse's ignorance resulted in expensive problems. For example, he did not understand the relationship of inductance and capacitance to a wire, which made the first transatlantic cable very, very difficult. In fact, it could take as much as 15 seconds to send a single dot. Ultimately, in trying to solve the problem, he cranked the voltage up so high that they blew out the wire. And it wasn't until 1866 that a second wire could be put in place and a better technology could be used. The basic telegraph design of Morse was simple and easy to understand. While he patented it, many competing telegraph designs were proposed. After the Morse telegraph system became the standard technology around the world, competitors simply ignored Morse's patents, copied his equipment, or designed their own in violation of his patents. Morse was forced to spend much of his remaining life in court enforcing his patent rights. Morse died in 1872, a wealthy but embittered man. By the time of his passing, U.S. newspaper readers were better informed of European news than most Europeans because major newspapers created ways to share articles around the world that made for lower cost and faster reporting. Today we still have these wire services such as Associated Press and Reuters. Several decades later, early radio was invented. Morse's code and system were adopted for early wireless telegraphy. In fact, the use of Morse code for radio continued up until recent times, at least for amateur radio enthusiasts or hams. Eventually, manual keying of characters would be replaced with mechanical signaling, which enabled teletypes. This was a distant ancestor to the modern internet. Today we remember Samuel Morse for two things: his large body of artwork, mostly portraits, and his combination to high-speed communication. The telegraph was a wonder in its day, but it also pointed future inventors in fruitful directions which continue to improve our lives today.